The laughter started before he even reached his designated position. It rolled through the Grand Convocation Hall of Vethkara like a slow, ugly wave, species by species, section by section, moving through 8,000 assembled delegates the way a fire moves through dry grass. Low rumbles from the Drekkathari contingent near the eastern pillars. Sharp, clicking chirps from the Zepeth diplomatic cluster. A long, wet, vibrating sound from the Molthene ambassador that, according to the universal translator clipped to every attendee's collar, meant something between absurd and embarrassing. All of it directed at one figure. Lieutenant Commander Aaron Vale, sole human representative to the first Grand Convocation of the United Galactic Assembly, stood at the center of the hall and did not move. He was 1.78 meters tall. In a hall where the average delegate stood between 2.5 and 4 meters, he looked like something that had wandered in through the wrong door. His uniform was dark navy with a single vertical silver stripe pressed with military precision. His hands were clasped behind his back. His face was composed, open, and completely infuriatingly still. "Is that the human?" The voice belonged to High Delegate Varath of the Drekkathari Dominion, loud enough to carry across 3 diplomatic sections. He was 3.5 meters of layered gray armor skin, with 4 eyes arranged in a diamond formation, and he was leaning sideways toward his aide with the relaxed contempt of a being who had never once in his life worried about being overheard. "They sent one? Only one?" "One, my lord," his aide confirmed. "It appears they could only afford the transit fare for a single representative." The laughter spiked again, louder. Aaron Vale heard all of it. His translator delivered every word with crisp, emotionless accuracy. He did not blink. From the upper observation gallery, Supreme Chancellor Oris Naval of the Galactic Council watched the spectacle with thin, satisfied amusement. The human had been invited as a gesture, a formality. Earth had applied for full assembly membership 11 standard years ago, and the Council had been quietly burying the application ever since. Inviting their representative to the convocation cost nothing and said nothing. It simply allowed the Council to point to the empty gesture later, if anyone asked. Nobody would ask. Nobody cared about Earth. "He is smaller than I expected," murmured Councillor Thresh Ven, standing at Naval's left shoulder. "I have seen Terran biological data. I knew they were compact. But seeing one in person..." He made a sound that did not translate as anything polite. "Insignificant," Naval agreed. "But harmless. Let them have their moment." Below, the Zepeth ambassador, a being of translucent lavender skin and 12 fingers on each hand, drifted close enough to Aaron to be deliberately invasive of his space. The Zepeth did this to subordinates as a dominance display. She looked him up and down with large, multifaceted eyes, and spoke in the clipped, musical tones her species used when they wanted their words to sting. "You are the species that still uses combustion fuel on your outer colony worlds, yes? I read a report. It said your fastest warships cross the inner systems in what you call weeks." She let that land. "We cross them in hours. Are you here to ask for directions home?" Polite laughter from the nearby Molthene cluster. The Drekkathari contingent was still going. Aaron looked at her. His gaze was calm, direct, and completely unreadable. He said nothing. The Zepeth ambassador tilted her head. Silence from a lesser delegate was either extreme deference or extreme arrogance, and she could not immediately determine which this was. She decided it was the former and moved on. Satisfied. Aaron had not moved. He had been trained for this. Not this specific situation, because nobody at command had quite imagined it would be this bad, but the principle of it, the philosophy beneath it. You do not give your enemy the satisfaction of your reaction. You do not negotiate your dignity away in exchange for momentary relief. You hold. You hold and you wait, and you remember that patience is not passivity. Patience is the most aggressive thing a person can do when every instinct is screaming. He had been screaming on the inside for approximately 40 minutes. He was very, very good at not showing it. The Grand Convocation was the largest diplomatic gathering in recorded galactic history. It had been called to formalize the post-war restructuring of the Assembly following the Drekkathari-Molthene conflict, which had lasted 6 standard years, consumed 4 inhabited systems, displaced 40 billion sentient beings, and ended only when both sides had exhausted themselves into a negotiated ceasefire that neither fully honored. The Council needed to look unified. They needed ceremony. They needed the visible affirmation of 8,000 delegates from 900 species standing together in a room and agreeing, for at least one afternoon, that collective civilization was preferable to mutual destruction. What they got in addition to all of that was something none of them had planned for. The announcement came through the external sensor network first. passed down from the orbital monitoring stations to the hall's operations center to the floor managers to the assembly's security chiefs, and then, in a cascading wave of professional alarm, to Supreme Chancellor Naval himself. 37 warships had just translated out of fold space in the outer system, not an unusual occurrence. The convocation had drawn delegations from across the known galaxy. Arrivals had been staggered over the previous 6 standard days, but these 37 ships did not match any registered arrival schedule, and when the monitoring stations ran their identification queries, the response that came back froze every senior security officer in the hall. The ships were Vrethkon. A silence moved through the upper galleries first, the kind that comes not from quiet but from everyone suddenly stopping talking at once. It dropped to the floor in seconds. The Vrethkon had not attended a diplomatic gathering in 63 standard years. They did not negotiate. They did not petition. They did not make formal appearances at council events. When the Vrethkon appeared somewhere, it was because they had decided something needed to change, and when the Vrethkon decided something needed to change, it changed. Empires had collapsed because a Vrethkon fleet had appeared on a long-range sensor sweep and simply waited. The psychological weight of their presence alone had ended wars. They were the oldest militant species in the known galaxy. They had been conquering, enforcing, and restructuring galactic civilization since before the Council existed. They called themselves the First Movers. Everyone else called them something that translated, depending on dialect and tone, as either the apex predators or the undying. Both were accurate. 8,000 delegates watched the main display screens as 37 Vrethkon warships moved into high orbit with the unhurried precision of beings who had never once worried about permission. Supreme Chancellor Naval gripped the gallery railing. "They were not invited," he said. "No, Chancellor," said his aide. "They were not." "Why are they here?" Nobody answered, because nobody knew. The delegation came down in a single transport. It touched the landing platform attached to the hall's northern entrance with the delicate precision of something built not for comfort but for effect, and when the doors opened, the Vrethkon Supreme Warlord Grathvel walked out. He was enormous, not in the theatrical way of the Drekkathari, who were large in the way that things built for physical domination are large. Grathvel was large the way a geological feature is large. He moved with the total absence of hurry that belongs only to things that nothing else alive would consider challenging. His armor was black composite material inlaid with red-gold geometric patterns that Aaron recognized from classified intelligence briefings as battle record markings. Each marking represented a campaign. There were many markings. Behind him came a quiet escort of 8 Vrethkon warriors who moved like shadows attached to a very large, very dangerous light source. The hall parted. It did not part because anyone was asked to move. It parted the way water parts for something heavy. Grathvel walked into the center of the grand convocation hall of Vethkara and stood for a moment, and 8,000 delegates watched him in absolute silence. Then he looked around the room, slowly, the way someone looks when they are searching for a specific face in a crowd. Not scanning, searching, with intent. His gaze moved across the Drekkathari delegation, past the Zepeth cluster, through the Molthene block, over the upper tiers and the lower assembly floor, past the council's designated seating, past the security cordons, and then it stopped. He walked forward. The crowd shifted to let him through, and then closed again behind him as he moved, so that there was always a corridor of clear space between him and wherever he was going. People moved without thinking about it, the way cells move for the heart. He was heading for the center of the floor. He was heading for the single figure standing alone in the middle of the room, who had not moved in over an hour, whose face had been calm through 40 minutes of laughter and insults and deliberate disrespect. The Vrethkon Supreme Warlord Grathvel stopped in front of Aaron Vale. He looked down. He was more than twice Aaron's height. His shadow covered the human completely. Aaron looked up. His expression did not change. Grathvel placed one enormous hand on Aaron's shoulder, with a gentleness that was almost incomprehensible from something that large. And he spoke one word: "Little brother." The silence that followed was so complete that Aaron could hear his own heartbeat. 8,000 delegates did not move, did not speak. In the upper gallery, Supreme Chancellor Naval had gone the particular pale color of a being whose model of reality has just cracked down the middle. The Drekkathari High Delegate Vareth had stopped mid-conversation with his aide and was standing with his 4 eyes fixed on the center of the floor, with an expression that was not quite fear, but was very close to its sophisticated older cousin. The Zepeth ambassador, who had spoken to Aaron about combustion fuel and travel times less than an hour ago, was completely still. Aaron did not look away from Grathvel's face. He did not smile, did not widen his eyes, did not do any of the things that shock produces in people who have not been trained to suppress it. He absorbed the moment. He had not known this was going to happen. Nothing in his briefing materials had prepared him for this, but he had been selected for this posting through a process he did not entirely understand, by people several layers above his pay grade, and he had learned a long time ago that the thing you do when the situation exceeds your preparation is you hold your shape and you wait for the shape of the situation to clarify itself. He held his shape. "I was told," Grathvel said, and his voice was low and resonant and carried to every corner of the hall without effort, that the humans were invited. I wanted to see for myself. He looked up then, away from Aaron, around the room. His gaze moved across the assembled delegates the way a weapon sweeps a perimeter. I see they were not made welcome. It was not phrased as a question. It was not phrased as an accusation. It was phrased as an observation, in the tone of a being making note of something that will be factored into subsequent decisions. In Vreth Khan diplomatic language, which Aaron had studied for 11 months before this posting, it was the most dangerous kind of statement. Nobody spoke. "Good," Grathvel said. "Then there is something to discuss." He did not explain. He did not elaborate. He turned his attention back to Aaron with an expression that Aaron, despite 11 months of study, could not fully read. There was recognition in it. There was something that in a human face he might have called grief. And there was something else. Something older. "Do they know?" Aaron asked. His voice was quiet, controlled. The question was directed only at Grathvel, but the hall was silent enough that it carried. The Vreth Khan warlord looked at him for a long moment. "No," he said. "They were made sure not to." In the upper gallery, Supreme Chancellor Naval turned to his chief security officer and spoke 2 words. "Lock the archives." The security officer moved immediately, reaching for his communications device, and then stopped. Looked at his screen, looked again. "Chancellor." His voice had changed. "The archive servers are already being accessed." Naval went very still. "By whom?" "The access codes are." The officer paused. "They are listed as Vreth Khan military intelligence. The access codes are valid. They are senior clearance." He looked up. "They are dated 63 years ago, Chancellor. Whoever set this access protocol did it 63 years ago. It has been waiting." Naval looked down at the center of the floor, where the supreme warlord of the most feared species in the known galaxy stood beside a young human who had been laughed at by 8,000 delegates less than 2 hours ago, and felt the specific cold that comes not from temperature but from the recognition that the game you thought you were playing was not the game that has been playing you. "What is in those archives?" he asked, very quietly. His aide, who had been running queries for the past 40 seconds, looked up from her screen. Her face had gone still in the way faces go still when the information they have just processed is too large for immediate reaction. "Everything," she said. "Chancellor, it is everything. The Veth Shar campaign, the founding accords, the original assembly charter." She paused. "And the classified annexes, the ones the council sealed after the founding war." Naval gripped the railing. "The ones that were sealed," he said slowly, "because of what they said about humans." "Yes, Chancellor." Below, Grathvel had leaned down slightly and was speaking to Aaron in a voice too low now to carry. Whatever he was saying, Aaron listened without expression, and then nodded, once with the clean precision of someone receiving confirmation of something they had already suspected. He reached into his left breast pocket and removed a small data chip. Standard military issue, the kind used for secure transfers. He held it up, and in the silence of the hall, under 8,000 watching eyes, the chip's surface caught the light. It was engraved with a symbol that had not been seen in official galactic records in 63 years. The seal of the original United Galactic Assembly Founding Council. Not the current council, the original one. The one that had been dissolved, restructured, and officially declared concluded at the end of the founding war, when the new assembly was established on terms that every species had agreed were final, comprehensive, and complete. The one whose classified founding documents had been sealed on the grounds that certain elements were, as the official record stated, operationally sensitive and potentially destabilizing to the newly established galactic order. The Zypeth ambassador took an involuntary step backward. The Drekathari High Delegate had placed one large hand on the shoulder of his nearest aide, not as comfort but as balance. Aaron held the chip up for one more moment. Then he looked up at the gallery, directly at the spot where Supreme Chancellor Naval stood, with the precision of someone who had known exactly where to look. And then, in the silence of the largest diplomatic gathering in galactic history, with 8,000 witnesses and 37 Vreth Khan warships in orbit overhead, Lieutenant Commander Aaron Vale of Earth said 4 quiet words. We were there first. In the archive servers, 63 years of sealed records began to open, and the history of the known galaxy, as every species in the hall had been taught it, had believed it, had built entire civilizations on top of it, began, very quietly, to come apart. Because the Galactic Council had not merely overlooked humanity in the official record of galactic civilization, they had erased them from it, deliberately, completely, with the full knowledge that without humanity, the founding war would not have ended. That without humanity, the original assembly would never have been built. That the peace 8,000 delegates were gathered to celebrate had been purchased, in the first place by a species they had spent the entire morning laughing at, and somewhere in those unlocking archives was a single document that the Council had spent 63 years making sure nobody would ever read. A treaty, signed in the aftermath of the founding war, signed by every original member species, signed, at the top, above every other name, by the human commander who had ended the war, a commander whose name had been removed from every official record in existence, a name that Grothvel, Supreme Warlord of the Vrethkon, had just spoken into Aaron's ear, a name that was, by blood and by record and by the oldest treaty in galactic history, Aaron Vale's. The data chip was 3 centimeters long. It weighed nothing. It contained everything. Aaron held it between his thumb and forefinger, and across the Grand Convocation Hall of Vethkara, 8,000 delegates watched it the way prey animals watch something they cannot yet classify as predator or phenomenon, uncertain whether to flee or simply stand very still and hope the moment passed without escalating. It did not pass. Supreme Chancellor Naval moved first, because chancellors of the Galactic Council do not survive 60-year political careers by being slow when crises arrive. He turned to his chief of protocol and spoke in a voice stripped of everything except command authority. Suspend the convocation. Medical emergency in the upper gallery. Clear the floor. His chief of protocol stared at him. There is no medical emergency, Chancellor. There will be, Naval said, if you do not start moving. But it was already too late for procedure, because the archive servers had been running for 47 seconds now, and the hall's internal information network, which had been designed for the simultaneous translation and distribution of diplomatic documents to 8,000 delegates, was doing exactly what it had been designed to do. It was distributing documents. Every delegate in the hall carried a personal information terminal, standard issue for convocation attendance, preloaded with the day's agenda, the Assembly's current charter, the post-war restructuring proposals, small, flat devices with screens that rested on the wrist or clipped to a lapel. They began to chime, not loudly, softly, one after another, a cascade of small sounds moving through the crowd like rain starting on a still surface. Delegates looked down at their terminals, looked up, looked down again. The Drekathari High Delegate Vareth read the first 3 lines of the document his terminal had received and then sat down directly on the floor of the Grand Convocation Hall, with no chair beneath him, which for a Drekathari of his rank and physical mass was so profoundly undignified that the 7 aides surrounding him did not know how to respond and simply stood there in stunned formation around their seated lord. The Zypeth ambassador read further than Vareth before her reaction hit, but when it hit with more force. She made a sound that her translator rendered as a sustained ascending tone with no direct linguistic equivalent, which the diplomatic notation system logged, after a brief processing delay, as involuntary vocalization indicating paradigm collapse. The Molthene ambassador did not make any sound at all. He simply stood with his terminal in both hands and read, and his coloration, which in Molthene biology shifts with emotional state the way human skin shifts with temperature, moved through 6 distinct phases in approximately 12 seconds. In the upper gallery, Naval watched his controlled, carefully managed, decades in construction political reality dissolve in real time, and felt the particular exhaustion of a being who has spent a very long time holding a door shut and has just run out of strength. How? He said, not to anyone specifically. To the situation itself. His security chief answered anyway. The access protocol, Chancellor. It was embedded in the archive system at the founding. Whoever placed it had administrator-level authority. The system treated it as a standing instruction, dormant for 63 years waiting for the authentication key. The chip, Naval said. Yes, and the boy. Yes, Chancellor. Naval looked down at the center of the floor, where Aaron Vale had not moved, had not looked at his own terminal, had not done anything except stand with the chip now returned to his pocket and his hands clasped behind his back in the same position he had held for the past 90 minutes. How long have they been planning this? Naval asked. The security chief said nothing, because the honest answer was longer than you have been alive, And that was not a thing you said to a chancellor. Below, Graithvel had positioned himself 2 paces to Aaron's left, and slightly behind, which in Vraith Khan body language meant something that every species in the hall with any diplomatic training recognized immediately. It was the position of a guardian, not an escort, not an honor guard, a guardian. The distinction was significant. An escort says, "This person is accompanied." A guardian says, "This person is under my protection," and if you move toward them with hostile intent, what happens next is entirely your responsibility. Nobody moved toward Aaron with hostile intent. Several beings moved toward him with questions, which is only slightly less dangerous in a diplomatic context. The first was a Theresi senior admiral named Qualdren, who pushed through the crowd with the purposeful momentum of a military officer who has decided that clarity is more important than decorum. "Human," he said. He stopped a respectful distance away, which was also a safe distance from Graithvel. "The document on my terminal, the founding charter annex." He paused. "It lists a human military commander as the architect of the Veth-Shar ceasefire protocol, the ceasefire that ended the founding war." "Yes," Aaron said, "the Veth-Shar protocol is listed in our official history as a Vraith Khan negotiated settlement. I know what it is listed as." Qualdren looked at him steadily. He was a professional military officer of 40 years' experience, and he had the particular quality such officers develop of being able to look at a situation with honest eyes even when the situation is uncomfortable. "You are telling me that is incorrect." "The archives are telling you that," Aaron said. "I am simply the delivery mechanism." Qualdren looked at Graithvel. The warlord looked back at him with the patient immobility of something geological. "Is it true?" Qualdren asked. Graithvel was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of evasion. The quiet of someone choosing the exact right words for a thing that has needed saying for a very long time. "Commander Soren Vale," Graithvel said, "walked into the Vraith Khan Supreme War Council alone, without weapon, without escort, without the sanction of the assembly or the knowledge of the council. He walked in and he sat down and he told us 3 things. He paused. He told us the war could not be won by force. He told us that the species fighting it would destroy the infrastructure of civilization before either side prevailed. And he told us that he had a solution." Qualdren's jaw worked. A human, a single human walked into the Vraith Khan War Council. He was the only being who had correctly analyzed the strategic position, Graithvel said, with something that in a human voice might have been respect scraped clean of any decoration. Our own commanders had not seen it. The Assembly's generals had not seen it. Soren Vale had seen it because he was looking at the whole board while everyone else was looking at their own pieces. He looked at Aaron. "It is a human quality. You look at the whole board." "What was the solution?" Qualdren asked. "The Veth-Shar protocol," Graithvel said. "A graduated ceasefire architecture with built-in verification mechanisms and a collective security guarantee, complicated, elegant. It required all parties to accept short-term vulnerability in exchange for long-term stability." He paused. No species at the table wanted to accept short-term vulnerability. Soren Vale spent 17 days in that War Council chamber, alone, and by the end of those 17 days, every Vraith Khan commander had agreed. The admiral stared. "How?" he argued. Graithvel said simply, "He was very good at arguing." The warlord's expression shifted slightly, and for a moment it looked almost like what a human would call a smile, filtered through anatomy that had never evolved for smiling. "He also, on the 3rd day, defeated 4 of our senior tactical officers in consecutive simulation exercises, which helped establish his credibility." Aaron said nothing. He had heard this story before, in fragments, in classified briefings he was not supposed to have accessed, through channels he was not supposed to have known about. He had spent 7 years assembling it from pieces that the Council had spent 63 years distributing across sealed archives, redacted databases, and classified military records that had been formally listed as destroyed. They had not been destroyed. They had been hidden. There is a difference, and the difference matters, because hidden things can be found. Aaron had always been very good at finding things. "Why was it covered up?" Qualdren asked. Graithvel looked toward the upper gallery. Naval had not moved from the railing. "Ask the Council," Graithvel said. The answer to that question was, in fact, currently being read by approximately 400 senior delegates who had reached page 11 of the founding charter annex, which was where the political context became fully explicit. The Galactic Council had not been established as a neutral governing body. It had been established as a solution to a specific problem, which was that after the founding war, the Assembly's original member species were faced with an uncomfortable reality. A small, young, biologically intense species from a single hostile planet had, in the span of the war's final 2 years, proven to be more strategically capable than any other species at the table. This was a problem, not because humanity was hostile. Commander Soren Vale had demonstrated the opposite. It was a problem because the political architecture of the post-war assembly was being built on a framework of established hierarchies, and those hierarchies required stable assumptions about which species were dominant. Humanity did not fit anywhere in those assumptions cleanly. They were too new, too capable, too unpredictable, too difficult to classify in a system that classified everyone. The decision had been made, documented in the annex with the clear-eyed bureaucratic brutality that only committees produce, that humanity's role in the founding war would be reclassified, minimized in the official record, removed from the founding documentation, and Earth would be placed in a category of developing worlds under provisional observation, which would keep them occupied, keep them manageable, and prevent them from accumulating the kind of political capital that their actual history entitled them to claim. Soren Vale had been offered a position on the original council. He had declined because he had read the founding charter and understood what the council was actually being designed to do. He had returned to Earth. He had left the data chip with Grathvel. He had said, according to the personal record that was now also circulating through the Hall's information network, 3 sentences before he left, "They will bury this. When the time comes, give it to someone who can use it. You will know who." 63 years later, Grathvel had walked into a diplomatic hall and placed his hand on the shoulder of a young man with the same bone structure, the same precise stillness, and the same particular way of looking at a room like he was reading a tactical map, and he had known. In the upper gallery, Councillor Thresh-Ven had been reading his terminal with the progressive horror of a being watching the structural supports of his entire career dissolve into vapor, and now he turned to Naval with something approaching desperation. "We need to issue a statement," he said, "a contextualization. The annex lacks context. The decisions made at the founding were what?" Naval asked. "Were made in good faith. We erased a species from their own history," Naval said, with the flat affect of someone who has passed through outrage and come out the other side into something colder. "In what faith were they made exactly?" Thresh-Ven had no answer. Below, Aaron had produced a second item. Not a chip this time, a small, folded document of the kind that had not been in common use for 60 years, printed on physical material, sealed with a physical seal. He held it out to Qualdren, who took it with the careful hands of someone handling something that might be explosive, which in a political sense it absolutely was. "That is the original membership application," Aaron said, failed by Commander Soren Val, on behalf of Earth in the second year of the post-war assembly. The application that the Council formally acknowledged and then buried. He paused. "It has never been formally denied. Under Assembly procedural law, an application that has not been formally denied remains active." He met Qualdren's eyes. "Earth has been a pending member of the Galactic Assembly for 63 years. We are here to complete the process." Qualdren looked at the document, looked at Aaron, looked at Grathvel. "You planned all of this." "Soren Vale planned all of this," Aaron said. "I simply showed up. You are his." Qualdren started, and then paused, recalibrating the word he had been about to use. "His descendant. His great-grandson." A sound moved through the crowd nearest to them, a ripple of recalculation, the audible sound of beings revising their models of the situation. The Drekathari High Delegate Vareth had gotten back to his feet. He was reading his terminal with an expression that had moved a considerable distance from where it had been when he had asked if the human could only afford one transit fare. He looked at Aaron across the floor with something complicated in his 4 eyes. He was remembering the things he had said. Most of the beings in the hall were remembering the things they had said. The Zpeth ambassador specifically was standing very still with the expression of someone reviewing a conversation about combustion fuel and travel times and understanding, with increasing clarity, that she had made those remarks to the great-grandson of the being who had personally ended the founding war by walking into the Vrethkon War Council alone and talking for 17 days. She looked at Aaron. Aaron did not look back at her. He was not interested in her discomfort. He was not here for apologies. Was not here to watch the beings who had laughed at him recalibrate into something resembling respect. He found neither outcome particularly satisfying. The embarrassment of other people has never been a substitute for justice. He was here for something specific, and he intended to get it. "I am requesting," Aaron said, pitching his voice to carry across the floor in the way he had been trained to project address in formal settings, "the immediate convening of an emergency session of the Assembly Membership Committee in accordance with Procedural Code 17, subsection 4, regarding applications pending for more than 50 standard years. He reached into his uniform pocket one more time and produced a third and final item, a formal motion document, drafted in the precise legal language of assembly procedure, signed and witnessed and notarized according to every applicable protocol. I am also filing a formal motion for the review and correction of official galactic historical records, under Article 9 of the Assembly Truth and Continuity Charter, to accurately reflect the documented contributions of Earth and its representatives to the founding of this institution. He looked up. I will require a second for the motion. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then Grathvel said, the Vrethkan nation seconds the motion. 4 more seconds. Then Qualdren said, in the careful voice of a military officer who has served a system his entire career and has just read documentation proving the system had a foundational lie at its center, the Tharasi Admiralty seconds the motion. And then, one by one, in ones and twos and then in growing clusters, terminals went up around the floor. Delegates who had been reading the annex for the past 8 minutes. Delegates who had history with the Council. Delegates from smaller species who had always suspected the founding architecture was built to serve the interests of the powerful and had spent 60 years without evidence. They had evidence now. In the upper gallery, Naval watched the seconds accumulate and understood that the door he had been holding shut for 63 years had not merely opened. It had come off its hinges entirely and was lying on the floor in pieces, and what was on the other side was not the destabilizing chaos that the founders had feared when they made their decision. It was simply the truth, which is, in certain circumstances, considerably more dangerous. He straightened his robes. He squared his shoulders. He was still the Supreme Chancellor of the Galactic Council, and whatever came next, he would face it with the composure his office required. He looked down at Aaron Vale, who was still standing in the center of the floor, still holding the motion document, still composed, still patient, still waiting. 63 years of institutional erasure. 6 decades of deliberate obscurity. A species kept at the margins of galactic politics through manufactured bureaucracy and carefully maintained condescension. And at the center of it all, one young human who had stood in this hall for 93 minutes while 8,000 beings laughed at him, who had held his shape through every insult and every dismissal, who had waited, patient as geology, for exactly the right moment. Naval thought about Soren Vale walking into the Vrethkan War Council alone. He thought about 17 days of argument that had ended a galactic war. He thought about a man who had been offered a seat at the table, had looked at what the table was actually for, and had declined, had left behind something better than a seat at the table, had left behind a key. Convene the session, Naval said quietly, to no one in particular, to everyone in general, to the situation which had moved beyond anyone's management now. Convene the session and open the record. Below, Aaron lowered the motion document and folded it precisely along its original crease lines and returned it to his pocket. He turned slightly to look at Grathvel. He said you would know, Aaron said. When he gave you the chip, he said you would know who. He was right, Grathvel said. How did you know? The warlord looked at him for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower, and the diplomatic formality had gone out of it entirely. You walked into this room, he said, knowing what was waiting for you. You stood in the middle of it for almost 2 hours. You did not flinch, you did not perform, you held your shape and you waited. He paused. Your great-grandfather stood in front of my war council, and 4 of my best tactical commanders told me afterward that they had never in their lives faced an opponent who was so completely and genuinely unafraid, not because he was reckless, not because he did not understand the danger. He met Aaron's eyes, because he had already decided what he was willing to lose, and everything beyond that line did not frighten him anymore. Aaron said nothing. I saw the same thing in you, Grathvel said. The moment you walked through the doors, around them the grand convocation hall was transforming. The careful architecture of the event, the choreographed diplomacy, the scripted proceedings had dissolved into something organic and irreversible, the particular organized chaos of history being made without a program. Delegates were moving in clusters, talking, arguing, reading, rereading. The Assembly Membership Committee Chair, a Thessalide jurist of impeccable procedural credentials who had spent 40 years applying rules with perfect even-handedness, was already calling for order and establishing the conditions of the emergency session with the focused efficiency of someone who privately suspects this day will be the most significant of her career. She was correct. Aaron looked up at the gallery one more time. Naval was still there, and their eyes met across the distance, and something passed between them that was not reconciliation and was not hostility. It was something more honest than either. It was the look that passes between two people when the pretense between them has been fully removed and what remains is simply the undecorated reality of what was done, and why, and what comes next. Aaron turned away first. He had no interest in the Chancellor as an opponent. The Chancellor was a consequence, not a cause. The cause was 63 years old, and everyone who had made the original decision was long dead. What mattered now was not punishment. What mattered now was the record. Grathvel fell into step beside him as he moved toward the committee floor, 2 paces back and to the left, and the crowd opened ahead of them and closed behind them, and the 8,000 delegates of the United Galactic Assembly who had spent the morning laughing at the tiny human from the insignificant planet watched him walk, and were quiet, not the quiet of contempt. The quiet that comes after you have misjudged something profoundly, and the full shape of your error has finally become clear, and you are standing in the space between who you were before you understood and who you will have to be now that you do. Somewhere in the archive servers, 63 years of sealed records were fully open. And somewhere in those records, on the last page of the document that had been buried deepest and sealed most carefully, was a single paragraph that the Galactic Council had classified above all others. A paragraph in which the original founding committee, in the careful bureaucratic language of beings who know they are doing something that will not survive honest examination, had recorded the true reason for erasing humanity from the founding record. Not because humans were weak, not because they were primitive, not because they were insignificant, but because a species that could end a galactic war through 17 days of argument, that could see the whole board while everyone else saw only their own pieces, that could stand alone in the center of a room full of beings who wanted to dismiss them and hold their shape until the moment was right. Such a species, the committee had written, in the careful clinical language of institutional fear, represented a long-term variable that the established order could not confidently predict or control. And so they had tried the only thing left to them. They had tried to make humanity forget what it was. It had not worked. It had never had a chance of working, because you cannot erase what a species carries in its bones. And humans, as the galaxy was now in the process of remembering, have always been very good at finding things that were hidden, especially themselves.